Imagine a history book, right?
Yeah.
Like a massive authoritative textbook.
Yeah, the kind they hand out in high school.
Exactly. You open it up, and it is completely, deliberately stripped of its female leaders. Just wiped clean.
Right. Just a glaring void where half the story should be.
It would be missing, the architect of ancient Egypt's greatest era of peace and prosperity. You would be entirely missing this mystic warrior who held back the entire Arab invasion of North Africa.
Yeah.
And, it would be missing the brilliant diplomat who basically saved a mythical Christian kingdom from absolute destruction. But the crazy thing is, that heavily redacted history, that is exactly what a lot of us were taught.
It really is. It's the standard narrative.
So today, for this deep dive, we are unpacking the extraordinary, complex reality of how women actually wielded immense power across the African continent over thousands of years. We've got a massive stack of sources today, mostly drawing from David Sweetman's historical research, and we are covering a huge scope. We're starting in 15th century BC Egypt and traveling all the way to 16th century Ethiopia.
It's a huge journey. And as we navigate this timeline with you today, we aren't just going to look at, what these women achieved. I mean, the accomplishments are staggering, but we have to examine the underlying mechanics of their societies.
Right, the why and the how.
Exactly. Why they mattered and how they acquired authority in the first place. Because this history, it fundamentally challenges all our assumptions about how power is acquired, how it's held, and ultimately how it's remembered by the people who write the books.
Yeah. That's the crucial part.
Yeah.
But before we get into the specifics, the pharaohs and warrior queens, we have to confront this massive historical blind spot right up front.
We really do.
Because to truly understand these women, we have to unlearn this deeply entrenched myth that was pushed heavily by, 19th century European historians, the myth of the golden age of matriarchy.
Yeah, it is a foundational misunderstanding in history.
Yeah.
For generations, these 19th century academics would look at African societies, or really ancient societies in general, and they would notice a specific pattern.
What kind of pattern?
Well, they saw that many groups traced their legendary mythological first ancestor to a woman. They documented the widespread worship of female fertility goddesses, things like that.
Right.
And from that purely religious, mythological evidence, these scholars made this massive, incredibly flawed leap of logic. They hypothesized that early human society was a pure matriarchy.
Like a utopian society ruled entirely by women.
Exactly. A feminist utopia that was eventually conquered and overthrown by warlike patriarchal men.
But that hypothesis completely misinterprets how mythology actually functions.
Right.
It's like assuming ancient Athens was governed by a council of women just because their patron deity was the goddess Athena.
That is the perfect analogy, yeah. The religious symbolism doesn't automatically translate to the socio-political reality on the ground. Modern anthropology completely unequivocally rejects this matriarchy theory.
So there was never this golden age where women just ran everything peacefully.
No, not at all. Modern anthropologists have demonstrated that religious myths are symbolic frameworks, right? They're for understanding nature and existence. They are not literal historical records of governance.
Yeah.
When you actually analyze the archaeological and historical records, rather than just reading the mythology, human societies across the globe have almost consistently been male-dominated. This whole golden age of matriarchy is a baseless assumption. It's essentially just a hangover from 19th century romanticism.
Just Victorian historians projecting their own weird anxieties about gender onto the ancient world.
Exactly that.
Okay, so if we accept that these societies were structurally male-dominated, heavily patriarchal, and, highly aggressive, it forces a much more interesting question.
Right.
How did these incredibly powerful women rise to the absolute top of warlike societies? Because they didn't just participate, they ruled.
And this is where we uncover the brilliant structural irony of ancient political power. Why did women rule in these hyper-territorial, male-dominated societies? Well, it's because powerful, warlike male kings were frequently absent.
No, because they're out fighting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you are an expansionist king, your primary job is out on the battlefield. You are constantly pushing your borders outward, commanding armies miles and miles away from your capital.
Which creates a massive logistical vulnerability back home.
A huge one. You are leaving your lands, your state treasury, your entire administrative bureaucracy behind for months, sometimes years at a time.
You have to leave the keys to the kingdom with someone.
Right. And in a cutthroat patriarchal system, the men left behind are actually your biggest threat.
Because a brother or an uncle or a cousin could easily use your absence to, what, bribe the palace guards, usurp the throne, and just lock you out when you get back.
That happened all the time. To protect their assets and their throne, these kings had to leave the state in the hands of the only people they could implicitly, biologically trust not to overthrow them.
So in these specific historical contexts, that meant their nearest female kin.
Yes. Primarily their mothers or their sisters.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. So you're saying that the rise of female power wasn't because these societies were inherently feminist, but actually because the men were so aggressively territorial, they couldn't even trust other men.
That is exactly the irony of it.
It's like a medieval corporate succession plan, where the CEO only trusts his sister with the company vault because he knows the vice presidents are all actively trying to stab him in the back.
That analogy captures the exact political calculation. Power flows to where trust is absolute. A sister or a mother was viewed as a safe custodian of power because her status was inextricably linked to the king's survival. If he falls, she falls.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And furthermore, this dynamic of trust actually led many male rulers to deliberately establish matrilineal succession, which, fundamentally altered the political landscape.
Let's break down those mechanics, because on the surface, a patriarchal king passing power through the female line sounds totally counterintuitive. How does that consolidate his power?
It all comes down to factionalism and the threat of rival clans. In these societies, a ruler typically had multiple wives, right?
Right.
Often taken from different powerful families or allied clans to secure diplomatic ties. Now, if the king chooses a son by one specific wife to be his heir, he instantly elevates that wife's entire extended family to the absolute center of power.
Oh, I see. And instantly alienates all the other wives and their powerful families.
Precisely, which basically guarantees a civil war the second he dies.
Right.
So to avoid this localized factionalism, rulers developed a system where inheritance and legitimacy passed through their sister. Or, alternatively, if a king's son was chosen, the boy's mother would immediately be elevated to a massive formalized position of power as a counselor.
Effectively becoming the second in command of the state.
Yes. The intention was just to use women to buffer male authority, but the system inadvertently created the perfect structural staging ground for female leadership.
See, it's a fascinating paradox. The very mechanisms designed to consolidate and protect male power basically built the infrastructure for women to take over entirely.
Yeah, absolutely did.
And no one utilized that infrastructure more effectively than our first leader today. She understood the mechanics of power, propaganda, and wealth better than anyone in Africa's first great civilization. We are talking about Hatshepsut.
Hatshepsut is a towering figure, not just in African history, but in global history. To understand her rise, we have to look at the psychological state of Egypt in the 15th century BC, during the New Kingdom period.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Well, Egypt had just survived a massive generational trauma. For centuries, the northern part of the country had been occupied by foreign invaders from the Levant, a group known as the Hyksos.
And they were pretty brutal, right?
They were. They had superior military technology composite bows, horse-drawn chariots, and they completely humiliated the Egyptian state.
So when the native Egyptians finally drive the Hyksos out, it completely changes their geopolitical strategy.
Radically. They went from being somewhat isolationist to becoming a fiercely aggressive, militarized empire. They basically decided that the best defense was a massive, overwhelming offense.
Right, they never wanted to be occupied again. So Hatshepsut's father, Thutmose I, and her brother, Thutmose II, they were absolute warrior kings, just expanding the borders deep into Nubia and the Middle East.
Exactly. The Egyptian state was running entirely on a wartime economy. But then the succession hits a crisis point.
What happens?
Hatshepsut was the royal daughter of Thutmose I. To legitimize his own claim to the throne, her half-brother, Thutmose II, actually married her.
Keeping it in the family, as they did.
As they did, yes. And they ruled jointly for several years. However, when he died unexpectedly in his early 30s, he did not leave a son by Hatshepsut. The only male heir available was a 6-year-old boy born to one of the king's minor concubines.
Okay, a 6-year-old.
Yes. This child was proclaimed pharaoh, taking the name Thutmose III.
But a 6-year-old cannot run a militarized empire. I mean, he can't lead armies, and he certainly can't manage the complex bureaucracy of the entire Nile Valley.
Not at all. So, following that exact matrilineal trust mechanism we just discussed, Hatshepsut stepped in as regent. She assumed control of the state apparatus to essentially protect the dynasty.
Right, keep the seat warm.
Right. And for the first few years, she played that traditional role, managing affairs on behalf of the child. But in the second or third year of their joint reign, something unprecedented happens. The young Thutmose III practically vanishes from the monumental artwork and all the official decrees.
Oh, wow.
Hatshepsut didn't just hold the seat warm anymore. She absorbed the absolute power of the state.
She simply took the throne. And what I find so brilliant about her strategy here is how she managed the optics of this takeover. She didn't just invent a new title for a ruling queen.
No, she did not.
She assumed the ancient, heavily codified title of king. She fundamentally altered her visual representation to force the Egyptian people to accept her authority. I mean, she had herself depicted in statues and relief carvings as a physically idealized man.
She went all in.
She wore the traditional shendi kilt, the Neem's headdress, and this is my absolute favorite detail. She wore the symbolic false beard of the pharaoh, and you can see it's held on by a visible strap in the carvings.
It is a remarkable piece of political theater. But we have to remember it was also a theological necessity.
How so?
In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a political executive. The pharaoh was the living incarnation of the god Horus on earth, and upon death became the god Osiris. The entire cosmology of the Egyptian state relied on the pharaoh maintaining something called Ma'at.
Ma'at, what is that exactly?
It translates roughly to cosmic order, truth, and balance. And the iconography of that divine role, the person who upholds Ma'at, was rigidly, fundamentally male.
So she couldn't afford to look like a temporary substitute or a motherly figure. By wearing the false beard and the male clothing, she wasn't trying to trick anyone into thinking she was biologically a man.
Yeah, everyone knew she was a woman.
She was just speaking the visual language of absolute divine authority. She was signaling to the priesthood and the people, I possess the divine right to maintain cosmic order. I am the king.
Exactly. She cleverly separated her biological gender from the theological office of the pharaoh. But having secured the office, her method of governing was a radical departure from the men who came before her.
Because they were all about war.
Right. Her predecessors were obsessed with military expansion. Hatshepsut shifted the entire machinery of the Egyptian state toward consolidation, internal development, and massive architectural projects.
She pivoted from a war economy to an infrastructure and trade economy.
A huge pivot, yeah.
And the pinnacle of this economic pivot was her famous maritime expedition to the land of Punt. Now, we know Punt corresponds roughly to the coastal region of modern-day Somalia or Eritrea, maybe Yemen. But the Egyptians revered it as divine Punt, right? It was the source of their most crucial luxury goods.
Frankincense, myrrh, gold, ivory, exotic animals. But you have to understand, these weren't just luxury goods. They were theological necessities.
Yeah, the temples.
Yes. Massive amounts of incense and myrrh were burned daily in the temples to placate the gods. The Hyksos occupation and all the subsequent wars of expansion had completely severed these vital trade routes for generations.
So how were they getting it before?
Previous attempts to reach Punt were grueling, dangerous overland treks. Hatshepsut decided to bypass the land routes entirely and project Egyptian power by sea.
Which requires an incredible logistical feat, because Egypt is a riverine society. They built flat-bottom boats for the calm waters of the Nile, but navigating the turbulent currents of the Red Sea requires a completely different class of vessel.
Completely.
And Egypt lacks tall, strong timber. So they had to import massive cedar logs from Lebanon, transport them down the coast, drag them across the eastern desert to the Red Sea, and construct a whole fleet of deep-water ships from scratch.
The logistics are just staggering to think about. And the murals in her spectacular mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, which, by the way, is an architectural masterpiece in its own right, built right into the sheer limestone cliffs, they document this expedition in granular detail.
Like a massive stone documentary.
Pretty much. The reliefs show the Egyptian fleet arriving and the sailors being greeted by the chief of Punt, a man named Perihu, and his wife, Eti.
It's an unprecedented record of ancient international diplomacy. And the expedition was a massive commercial success.
Unbelievably successful.
They didn't just bring back bags of resin. They actually brought back 31 live myrrh trees with the roots carefully packed in baskets of earth. And they successfully transplanted them in the courtyards of her temple.
It's early botanical engineering.
Yeah. It proved she could deliver the wealth of the gods without shedding a single drop of Egyptian blood on the battlefield.
However, as we know, peace and prosperity are not universally celebrated.
Especially by people who profit from war.
Exactly. Hatshepsut's reign was marked by an intense, simmering internal culture war. On one side of this divide, you have Hatshepsut and her inner circle of brilliant, highly capable administrators, and the most prominent among them was her chief advisor and architect, Senenmut.
Now, Senenmut is a fascinating character study in how Hatshepsut centralized her power, isn't he?
He really is. He wasn't born into the high nobility. He came from relatively humble origins, yet under her reign he rose to hold over 80 different titles. He became the tutor to her daughter and the chief architect of her greatest monuments.
His rise kind of indicates that Hatshepsut valued merit and absolute loyalty over those entrenched aristocratic bloodlines.
Yes, she was building her own power base. And he was so powerful and honestly so bold that he secretly carved his own image into the hidden alcove doors of Hatshepsut's great temple at Deir el-Bahri.
I love this detail. He literally chiseled his own face into the boss's divine monument, hiding behind the doors. The audacity of that is incredible.
It borders on outright heresy, really, but it highlights the unprecedented influence of her inner circle. This faction, Hatshepsut, Senenmut, and the high priest of Amon, Hapusneb, they represented this coalition of peace, trade, and internal development.
But directly opposing them was a powerful, entrenched faction of traditionalist priests and military nobles who desperately wanted to return to war.
Because in ancient Egypt, war was a highly lucrative enterprise.
Right, because of the spoils.
Precisely. A warrior pharaoh who conquers foreign lands brings back immense spoils. Gold, cattle, slaves, and direct tribute. And a massive percentage of this war booty was historically donated directly to the temples of the state god, Amon at Karnak.
Ah, so peace might have been profitable for the merchants and the state treasury, but a lack of war meant a total lack of plunder for the priesthood.
You follow the money. This aggressive faction threw all their political weight behind the young sidelines Thutmose III. He was spending his youth training in the military barracks, just waiting for his chance.
And this tension boils over into a piece of political theater that is just astounding. The opposition actually staged a quote-unquote miracle right in the middle of the Temple of Karnak.
It is a textbook example of religious manipulation for political ends.
Walk us through what happened.
Okay, so during a major festival day at Karnak, the high priests were carrying the sacred bark. This is the heavy, boat-like shrine that contains the literal statue of the god Amun. They're carrying it in a grand procession around the temple courtyard.
Right.
Suddenly, the priests claimed the statue became impossibly heavy. They began to stagger, deviating from the traditional ceremonial route, acting as if the god inside the shrine was physically directing their movements.
So they're putting on a massive show for the huge crowd, pretending the god has basically taken the wheel.
Exactly. The priests carried the struggling bark directly to where the young Thutmose III was standing in the courtyard. The procession halted, and the heavy shrine was dipped low, making the god Amun physically bow to the young prince.
Wow.
It was a blatantly orchestrated stunt. It was a public declaration by the priesthood that the gods favored the warrior prince over the reigning female king.
I mean, that is a direct threat to her legitimacy. If the priests turn the public against her, she's finished. But her response is what makes her a genius. She doesn't panic. She doesn't order a mass execution of the priests, which would definitely trigger a civil war.
No, she's much smarter than that.
Instead, she engages in a campaign of overwhelming, undeniable architectural dominance.
She fought theology with geology.
I love that phrase.
It's true. Hatshepsut commissioned the quarrying of 2 massive granite obelisks from Aswan. These were single blocks of stone, weighing hundreds of tons each.
Just massive.
The engineering required just to cut them out of the bedrock, float them hundreds of miles down the Nile on specialized barges, and erect them using sandpit mechanics. It is still marveled at today.
And she didn't just put them anywhere. Here's where it gets really interesting. She had the roof of the temple at Karnak, the very stronghold of the priests who opposed her. She had the roof physically dismantled so she could drop these 2 towering obelisks right into their sacred space.
A total power move.
It is the ultimate ancient Egyptian mic drop. She had the tops of the obelisks coated in electrum, a mixture of gold and silver, so they would catch the sun and literally blind anyone looking at them. And carved down the sides of these monoliths were massive inscriptions, boasting of her absolute power and divine right to rule.
It was an inescapable, permanent assertion of dominance. She essentially told the priesthood, your god may have bowed, but my monuments touch the sky.
Yeah, you can't argue with a 100-ton rock.
You really can't. She neutralized their political stunt with an awe-inspiring display of wealth and logistical capability, and she held on to absolute power until her death in 1458 BC. At which point, Thutmose III finally assumed sole rule and became the great military conqueror the Pais had always wanted.
Which brings us to the aftermath of her reign. Because for a long time, the historical narrative was that Thutmose III hated her so much that he immediately set about destroying her memory. Smashing her statues, chiseling her name out of the temple walls, defacing her images.
That is the traditional assumption, yeah. It's driven by a simplistic view of a vengeful stepson just throwing a tantrum. However, modern archaeological dating tells a much more nuanced story.
What does the dating show?
The destruction of Hatshepsut's monuments did not happen immediately upon his ascension. In fact, Thutmose III waited until very late in his own reign, perhaps 20 years later, to begin the systematic erasure of her name.
Now, if he was purely motivated by blind rage and hatred, he would have smashed her statues on day one.
Exactly.
The delay suggests something much more calculated.
It suggests a complex, perhaps grudging respect for the undeniable stability of the state she handed over to him. Think about it. The wealth generated by her expedition to Punt and her internal development directly funded his massive subsequent military campaigns in the Levant. He couldn't deny the foundation she built.
But as he neared the end of his life, he needed to ensure his own son's smooth succession.
Right. He needed to cement a purely patriarchal narrative of the dynasty.
So he had to rewrite the history books to make sure a female king remained a weird anomaly, not a precedent. It's the ultimate form of political rebranding. You erase the predecessor whose infrastructure you rely on, ensuring your own legacy stands alone.
It's ruthless but effective. Hatshepsut bent the entire Egyptian paradigm to her will, but she remained a singular exception in their history.
However, if we move geographically south, up the Nile River into Nubia, we encounter a civilization where female rule was not an exception at all.
Right, we are transitioning from the anomaly of Egypt to the systemic female authority of the Kingdom of Kush, specifically during the era of Meroe.
Now, the Kingdom of Kush has a fascinating trajectory. For centuries, it was heavily influenced and at times dominated by Egypt. Their initial capital was a city called Napata, where the culture and the priesthood of Amon heavily mirrored the Egyptian model up north.
But eventually, the geopolitical center of gravity shifted hundreds of miles south to a city called Meroe.
Why did they move?
This relocation to Meroe was a masterstroke of geographical strategy. It is highly probable, based on historical fragments, that this move was spearheaded by a female leader, Queen Bartere. By moving the capital south, they achieved two crucial objectives. First, they distanced themselves from the overbearing political influence of that traditional priesthood of Amon at Napata.
Getting away from the old guard.
Exactly. Second, they situated themselves in an incredibly fertile, resource-rich environment.
Meroe was effectively an island-like fortress of prosperity. It sat between the main channel of the Nile and the Atbara rivers. The ecology there allowed for massive, sustained herds of cattle, which was a huge marker of wealth. But more importantly, Meroe sat directly atop a geological gold mine, right?
Well, an iron mine, technically. But yes, it was their gold mine. The adoption and mastery of iron smelting transformed Meroe into an absolute African superpower.
Because iron technology fundamentally alters a society's capabilities.
So completely. With iron plowshares, you can cultivate harder, more extensive tracts of land, driving a massive population boom. With iron weapons, your military can shatter the bronze swords and shields of your enemies.
The archaeological evidence of their industry is just staggering. I mean, they produce so much iron that early archaeologists literally referred to Meroe as the Birmingham of Africa, referencing the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, there are just massive mountainous heaps of iron slag surrounding the ancient city ruins to this day.
And because they were churning out so much iron, their traditional value systems shifted dramatically. They had vast reserves of actual gold, but iron was the true driver of their economy. I love this detail from the classical texts. It is recorded that the Kushites had so much gold they didn't know what to do with it, so they literally bound their common prisoners in chains made of solid gold.
It's an amazing detail. It perfectly illustrates their immense material wealth and their completely divergent economic paradigm compared to the Mediterranean world. Gold was cheap, iron was power.
Right?
And this wealth, combined with their strategic control of the trade routes linking Central Africa to the Red Sea ports, inevitably brought them into conflict with the ultimate predatory superpower of the age.
The Roman Empire.
The Roman Empire.
Because by 30 BC, the Romans, under Augustus, had conquered Egypt, right? Absorbing it as a personal province to feed the Roman populace. And it didn't take long for the Romans to start looking south toward the wealth of Kush.
They always wanted more. The Romans attempted to impose taxation and assert dominance over the border regions near the first cataract of the Nile. But the Kushites, fiercely independent and highly militarized, absolutely refused to submit.
They didn't just refuse, they launched a preemptive strike.
They did. They struck against the Roman garrison at a fort called Syene, which is modern-day Aswan.
And it wasn't just a military raid. It was a profound act of psychological warfare. The Kushite forces overran the fort and tore down a massive bronze statue of the Roman Emperor Augustus. They decapitated the statue, carried the bronze head all the way back to Meroe, and deliberately buried it beneath the steps of a temple dedicated to victory.
So symbolic.
They designed it so that every time a Kushite citizen walked into the temple, they were literally stepping on the face of the Roman emperor. It is an incredible display of defiance.
Naturally, the Roman Empire could not let such a brazen insult go unanswered. The Roman governor of Egypt, a man named Gaius Petronius, mobilized his legions, marched south into Kush, pushed the defenders back, and sacked their old religious capital of Napata around 23 BC.
Okay, so the Romans strike back.
But the Roman historians who documented this conflict, writers like Strabo and Pliny, they recorded something that shocked them. The Kushite military was commanded not by a king, but by a terrifying, fiercely capable queen.
Right. And the Romans called her Candace. And this name became legendary. I mean, it echoes through history. It even appears in the New Testament of the Bible. The Acts of the Apostles mentions a powerful Ethiopian eunuch who managed the vast treasury of Queen Candace. So the Romans basically believed they were fighting a single, immortal warrior queen.
And here we encounter a massive, centuries-long historical misunderstanding. The Romans, despite all their bureaucratic obsession and record-keeping, made a fundamental linguistic error.
What did they get wrong?
Candace was never a personal name.
This completely rewrites how we understand their history. So what were the Romans actually hearing when they wrote down Candace?
Well, in the Meroitic language, the title for a royal woman, whether she was a ruling monarch, a queen mother, or a highly influential consort, was Kik.
Kik.
The Romans heard this official title, Ktik, phoneticized it into Latin and Greek as Candace, and mistakenly assumed it was the woman's legal first name.
It is staggering when you think about it. The Romans fought a protracted, brutal war against a succession of highly capable female commanders over several decades. And instead of learning their actual names, the Romans just referred to all of them as queen, because they couldn't be bothered to understand the political structure of the enemy they were fighting.
That's exactly what happened.
It's the equivalent of foreign power invading the United States, fighting 3 different administrations over 12 years, and writing in their history books that they waged war against a singular immortal being named Mr. President.
It's hilarious when you frame it that way, but it perfectly encapsulates how much of our global historical narrative has been filtered through and honestly distorted by the biased, ignorant lenses of outside conquerors. They couldn't conceptualize a society where female leadership was an institutionalized norm, so they flattened the complexity into a single mythical figure.
Fortunately, modern archaeology and the slow deciphering of the Meroitic script have allowed us to strip away the Roman myth and give these women their actual names back.
Yes, we now have a lineage of distinct, powerful rulers. Following Queen Bartere, who likely established the new capital, we see the rise of Queen Shenectocait in the late 2nd century BC. Her reign is archaeologically crucial because her tomb complex provides the very first datable inscriptions using the Meroitic hieroglyphic alphabet.
Oh wow, so that's a massive cultural milestone. They're no longer just copying Egyptian hieroglyphs. They have developed their own independent written voice to record their own history.
Exactly, they are stepping out of Egypt's shadow. Then we arrive at the specific Candace who actually fought the Roman legions, Queen Amerinus. The Roman historian Strabo described her with a mixture of awe and terror. He called her a masculine sort of woman and blind in one eye.
A one-eyed warrior queen commanding armies against the might of Rome. That is cinematic.
She was a brilliant tactician. She understood that she couldn't defeat the Roman legions in open field head-to-head infantry battles, so she engaged in fierce, relentless guerrilla warfare.
Using the desert to her advantage.
Right. She harassed the Roman supply lines so effectively that she forced Governor Petronius to a complete standstill. Ultimately, she forced the Roman Empire to the negotiating table on the island of Samos. and she secured a peace treaty that heavily favored Kush, remitting the taxes Rome had tried to impose, and securing the independence of Meroe for centuries.
She fought Augustus Caesar to a draw and won her kingdom's freedom. That is legendary. And the wealth that followed her victory is incredible. We then see Queen Amenhotep, who ruled during a profound golden age of trade and prosperity.
The economic indicators from Amenhotep's era are fascinating. During her reign, we don't just see monumental temples being built, we see a booming, wealthy middle class.
How do we know that?
The archaeological footprint. The records indicate everyday citizens living in beautifully constructed, ornate beehive huts made of tightly woven reeds, drinking milk from finely crafted bronze bowls.
Bronze bowls for regular citizens.
Yeah, there was a proliferation of specialized professions, artists, doctors, craftsmen. The wealth wasn't just hoarded at the very top, it circulated through the society.
Which brings us to a visual representation of this distinct culture. Later in the 1st century AD, Queen Amenhotep ruled alongside King Natakamani. They were massive builders, restoring temples across the kingdom. But there is a specific relief carving of Queen Amenhotep at the Lion Temple at Naka that reveals a profound rejection of outside influence.
The artwork at the Lion Temple is a powerful declaration of cultural independence. For centuries, because of the overwhelming proximity of Egypt, Nubian and Kushite royals often depicted themselves conforming to the Egyptian artistic ideal.
You mean those stiff, rigid postures with hyper-slender, wasp-waisted physiques?
Exactly. They were imitating the superpower next door, but at Naka, Queen Amenhotep is carved with a completely different, distinctly African aesthetic.
She is depicted as physically massive, right? Wide-waisted, plump, deeply imposing.
Yes, she is heavily adorned with jewelry, exuding raw physical power and maternal abundance.
So she is looking at the beauty standards of the Egyptian and Roman worlds and entirely rejecting them. She is defining beauty, health, and power on her own terms, in her own cultural image, and carving it into stone for eternity.
It is a phenomenal visual legacy. Meroe remained an inward-looking, wealthy African powerhouse under the guidance of these queens for hundreds of years. They successfully held off the Roman Empire, although they were eventually absorbed by the neighboring kingdom of Axum around 350 AD.
Okay, so while Rome failed to penetrate the deep south of Kush, they did successfully hold the northern coast of Africa for centuries. But as we know, the geopolitical map is always shifting.
Always.
The Roman Empire fractured, the Byzantine remnants in North Africa grew weak, and a massive, unprecedented force swept out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century AD, the Arab expansion following the death of the Prophet Muhammad.
The speed and momentum of the Arab armies were staggering during this period. They swept across Egypt and Libya, seemingly unstoppable, driven by religious fervor and military efficiency.
But when they reached the Maghreb, which is the mountainous regions of modern-day Tunisia and Algeria, their momentum violently stalled.
They didn't hit a Roman fortification, they hit a unified indigenous resistance led by a Berber prophetess.
We are talking about the Kahina. And to understand this clash, we have to look closely at the socio-economic reality of the Berber people, because they were the indigenous inhabitants of North Africa, a people who had survived Roman, Vandal, and Byzantine occupations.
The Berbers were fundamentally an agrarian society. They were deeply tied to the land. They cultivated wheat, tended massive olive groves, and lived in settled, fortified farming communities in the valleys and mountains. Their entire social structure was built around the cycles of agriculture.
And their leader was a woman named Dihya, known to history as the Kahina. She was a leader of the Jarawa Berber tribe in the rugged Ares Mountains. The historical texts describe her as a widow of vast age, suggesting she possessed, decades of political and tribal knowledge. But her authority wasn't purely administrative, was it? She was a mystic.
She operated as a prophetess. And that's a role that held, and in some Berber cultures, still holds, immense, almost unquestionable authority. The accounts of her leadership are striking. Before making major strategic decisions, she would enter deep, trance-like states.
Like actual trances?
Yes. These trances were facilitated by intense rituals involving the rhythmic beating of drums and loud music. The texts describe her spinning wildly, her hair streaming out, beating her chest until she achieved a state of ecstasy from which she would deliver prophecies and military commands.
That level of charismatic, supernatural authority gave her the power to unite fiercely independent, often fractured Berber tribes into a cohesive military force. Now, earlier European historians often framed the Kahina's war against the Arabs purely as a religious crusade, right?
Yeah.
Assuming that because she was likely Christian or Jewish, she was fighting a holy war against Islam.
That was the old interpretation. But while religious differences certainly existed, framing it purely as a holy war entirely misses the fundamental socioeconomic conflict at play.
What was the real conflict?
The clash was between two diametrically opposed ways of life. The Berbers, as we established, were settled agriculturalists. The advancing Arab armies at that specific historical moment were perceived by the Berbers as nomadic conquerors.
Ah, I see. So the Berbers saw the Arab armies not just as a new administration, but as a threat to their physical relationship with the earth.
Yes. They feared the nomads would pillage the farms, disrupt the harvests, and turn the carefully cultivated land into grazing pasture for their horses and camels.
So the Kahina wasn't just fighting a new theology. She was fighting to prevent the eradication of an entire agrarian civilization.
Exactly, and her initial defense of that civilization was spectacular. In the late 7th century, the Arab general Hassan ibn al-Numan marched a massive, battle-hardened army toward the Aras Mountains to crush the resistance. The Kahina ambushed them near the river Mesquiana.
And she completely routed them. She utilized her knowledge of the mountainous terrain, combined with the absolute fanaticism of her united Berber forces, to trap and destroy the Arab vanguard.
Yeah.
I mean, she inflicted such a devastating defeat that the Arabs literally named the battlefield the River of Trials.
It was a shocking disruption of the Arab conquest. General Hassan was forced into a humiliating retreat, pulling his forces all the way back toward Libya to wait for reinforcements. He realized he could not defeat the Kahina in a conventional battle, while she held the geographic advantage of the mountains and the total loyalty of the populace.
So the Kahina had the military genius, she had the geographic high ground, and she had the charismatic authority. But here's where the narrative shifts from a story of triumphant resistance into a devastating Greek tragedy. The Kahina lacked long-term economic foresight.
This is her tragic, fatal flaw. The Kahina knew General Hassan was regrouping. She knew he would eventually return with a larger force. She analyzed the situation from a purely military perspective, divorced from economic reality, and made a catastrophic strategic decision.
She implemented a merciless scorched-earth policy.
Yes. She decided to destroy the very thing she was fighting to protect.
What did she actually do?
She ordered her fiercely loyal Berber warriors to turn on their own infrastructure. They chopped down their ancient, yielding olive groves. They set fire to their own fields of grain. They burned their villages and dismantled their fortifications.
That is insane. Why would she do that?
Her tactical logic was brutal but simple. The Arab armies are motivated by plunder. If I turn the Maghreb into a desolate, starving wasteland, there will be nothing for them to conquer, and they will lack the resources to sustain an invasion force.
It's a devastating miscalculation. She's treating the land as a tactical chessboard, but for her people, those olive groves are generational wealth. An olive tree takes decades to mature. You chop that down, you don't just lose a harvest, you destroy the economic future of your grandchildren. You destroy the social contract.
Exactly. The agrarian Berbers, who had united behind her to protect their farms, were forced to watch their own queen orchestrate their starvation. The alliance violently fractured, the land was ruined, and the people were left destitute. In a tragic, ironic twist of history, many of the starving Berber tribes actually sent envoys to the Arab general, Hassan, begging him to return, bring food, and restore administrative order.
Wow. So her greatest strength, her absolute, unyielding commitment to resistance, became the instrument of her own destruction. She basically burned down the house to keep the burglar out, and her people froze in the winter.
It's tragic.
The historical sources say she realized her mistake too late. She went into one final desperate trance and foresaw her inevitable defeat.
Right. Recognizing that her scorched earth policy had doomed her movement, she made a final, incredibly pragmatic decision. She ordered her two sons to abandon her, cross the desert, and surrender to the Arab forces. She instructed them to convert and integrate into the Islamic military structure so that her bloodline and her people might survive the coming annexation.
And shortly after, around 701 or 702 AD, she fought her final battle. She was cornered and killed near a well at Tabarka. Her head was severed and sent to the Umayyad Caliph as proof that the Berber resistance was finally broken.
It is a really dark end, but her legacy is incredibly complex because of that final order to her sons.
How so?
If you look at the long arc of history, short-term military defeats often lay the groundwork for massive long-term cultural shifts. Her sons and the thousands of Berbers who integrated into the Islamic Empire did not just fade away, they became the elite vanguard of the new military order.
They took over from the inside.
Quite literally, just a decade later, it was a Berber general, Tariq ibn Ziyad, who led the Islamic invasion across the strait into Europe, conquering the Iberian Peninsula.
Wait, really?
Yes. The Rock of Gibraltar is actually named after him, Jebel el-Tariq, the Mountain of Tariq. The subsequent glorious civilization of Moorish Spain, with its incredible advancements in science, architecture, and philosophy, was built heavily on the backs of the Berber people. The Kahina lost her war in the mountains, but her people fundamentally shaped the future of two continents.
It radically changes how we measure victory and defeat in the historical record. I mean, wow. Okay, now, we are going to move from the scorched earth of the North African coast straight south across the vast expanse of the Sahara Desert into the heart of West Africa. We are moving from a queen who destroyed her civilization's infrastructure to a queen who obsessively built it.
We are going to look at Queen Amina of Hausaland.
Yes. Now, the Hausa states were located in the region that encompasses mostly modern-day northern Nigeria, and the mythology surrounding their origin is a classic hero narrative.
It really is. According to folklore, the region was originally ruled by a succession of 17 queens. The final queen was facing a crisis. A monstrous snake named Sarki was hoarding the water supply in the central well of the city of Dora.
Right, a very classic setup. A wandering prince from Baghdad named Abiazidu arrives on the scene. He slays the giant snake, frees the water, and as a reward, marries the queen. Their subsequent offspring go on to found the 7 foundational, legitimate Hausa states.
The myth serves to explain the cultural synthesis of indigenous West African matrilineal traditions with the incoming Islamic patriarchal influences from the East. But by the time we reach the 15th or 16th century, the era of Amina, these 7 Hausa states are not mythological. They are very real, very wealthy, and highly competitive independent city-states, constantly fighting for dominance over trade.
And Amina was born into the royal family of the state of Zazzau, which we know today as Zaria. She was the daughter of Queen Bakwa Turunka. From a very young age, Amina was designated as the heir apparent, and because of her status and the immense wealth of Zaria, she was heavily pursued by powerful men seeking a political alliance.
The sources indicate she was practically bombarded with marriage proposals. Neighboring rulers and powerful merchants sent her daily tributes of enslaved people, luxurious textiles, and gold, attempting to secure a political marriage that would give them leverage over Zaria.
And she categorically rejected every single one of them. She recognized that in her political climate, taking a husband meant diluting her own authority. She had zero interest in being a co-ruler, and she certainly wasn't going to be relegated to a traditional wife.
She wanted absolute power.
Yes. When she ascended to the throne, she didn't just sit in the palace and manage the administration. She mounted a horse, strapped on armor, and initiated a relentless military expansion.
She embarked on a 34-year military campaign. Let that sink in. 34 years.
That's a lifetime of war.
She personally led her cavalry and infantry, conquering the rival Hausa states like Katsina, Kano, and Bauchi. She didn't just raid them, she incorporated them. She pushed the borders of Zaria south to the Niger River and west toward the coast, effectively unifying the disparate Hausa city-states into a singular, sprawling empire for the first time in their history.
But her military conquests were just a means to an end, right? Amina wasn't just a warlord, she was an economic visionary.
Completely. By conquering that specific geographic footprint, she completely monopolized the most lucrative economic veins of West Africa. She locked down the terminus points of the north-south trans-Saharan trade routes, and she controlled the east-west Sudanic trade corridors.
So suddenly, if you wanted to move goods across West Africa, you had to pay tolls to Amina.
Yes. Her control of trade generated unprecedented wealth. To understand the scale of her intimidation and economic power, we look at the tribute paid by the neighboring ruler of Nubia. He didn't just send gold, he sent a tribute of 40 eunuchs and 10,000 kola nuts.
The kola nuts are the crucial detail here, aren't they?
Absolutely. Kola nuts were a highly prized luxury commodity. It's a caffeine-rich stimulant used extensively in social, political, and religious ceremonies across West Africa.
And they were hard to get.
Very difficult to cultivate and highly valuable. Historical tradition credits Amina's conquests with opening the corridors that brought this massive influx of kola nuts and other luxury goods deep into Hausaland, fundamentally elevating their standard of living and commercial power.
But the most enduring legacy she left behind wasn't the trade goods. It was the physical infrastructure she built to secure them. Everywhere she marched, every time she conquered a new territory, she constructed massive, walled military encampments.
These structures are an engineering and logistical marvel, and their ruins can actually still be seen across northern Nigeria today, universally known as Amina's walls.
Let's talk about the logistics of these walls. Because they were constructed of heavily rammed earth, baked hard by the relentless sun, and some of these enclosed areas were massive, stretching up to 15 miles in circumference.
They weren't just simple defensive perimeters around a small town. They functioned as permanent forward operating bases. When you are leading a 34-year military campaign, the hardest part isn't taking ground, it's holding it.
Right, because usually armies have to retreat when the rainy season starts or when supplies run low.
Exactly. Amina's walls meant she could garrison troops permanently in conquered territory. She created a permanent infrastructure of control that secured the trade routes year-round. She essentially built a fortified highway system across West Africa.
However, as is so often the case with powerful women who upend patriarchal norms, the historical record couldn't merely document her military and economic genius. Oral tradition and folklore attached a deeply dark, scandalous myth to her character.
It always happens.
The folklore is wild. It claims that because she refused to marry and share power, she would simply take a new, temporary lover from the local population in every single town she conquered. She would spend the night with him, and then, when the army marched out the next morning, she would have the man beheaded, so he could never boast about sleeping with the queen or claim any illegitimate royal status.
It is a brutal, vampiric piece of mythology. It's designed purely to monstrosize her ambition.
It's the ultimate terrifying HR violation. But seriously, let's apply a critical lens to this myth. Think about the massive double standard in how history records state violence. If a male king conquered a hostile city, took a local woman to his bed, and then had her quietly executed the next day to prevent the birth of a rival bloodline, historians wouldn't call him a monster.
No, they would call him a ruthless pragmatist. They would praise him for securing the dynasty against rivals.
Exactly. When a man employs lethal pragmatism to protect his power, it's considered statecraft. When a woman does it, or is merely rumored to have done it, she is transformed into a deviant, predatory villain. She is literally the CEO who builds the infrastructure, the walls, the trade routes. But folklore only remembers the scandalous myths.
The myth of the executed lovers is a textbook example of how patriarchal societies psychologically process and punish female power. They cannot simply accept her competence, so they attack her morality.
But if we strip away the scandalous folklore and focus on the economics, her real legacy is undeniable.
It is. After her death, her specific military empire couldn't hold together. The Hausa states eventually fractured back into competitive entities. But the physical infrastructure she built, the rammed earth walls, the secured trade corridors, survived.
And that infrastructure allowed generations of Hausa merchants and peddlers to safely traverse the region, allowing them to dominate West African commerce for centuries to come.
The political borders dissolved, but the economic arteries she paved continued to pump wealth into the region. It proves a fundamental historical rule. Good infrastructure outlasts empires.
Good infrastructure outlasts empires. Which is a perfect segue to our final leader for this deep dive. Because while Amina was fighting on horseback to secure trade routes in West Africa, on the exact opposite side of the continent, in East Africa, a queen was using diplomacy, religious theology, and incredible geopolitical foresight to save an entire empire from being wiped off the map.
We are heading to 16th century Ethiopia to analyze the strategies of Empress Helena.
And to fully appreciate the magnitude of Empress Helena's diplomatic achievement, we first have to understand the geopolitical delusions of Europe at this time. We have to look at how wildly, almost comically wrong, the European understanding of Ethiopia actually was.
This is one of the most fascinating historical misunderstandings of the entire medieval era. For centuries, the kings and popes of Europe were utterly convinced that somewhere deep in Africa or Asia there existed a magical, overwhelmingly powerful Christian kingdom ruled by a monarch known as Prester John.
Prester John. The mythology of Prester John was an intoxicating fantasy for a Europe that felt culturally isolated and militarily threatened by the expanding Islamic empires of the Middle East. The European texts described Prester John as this holy priest king of unimaginable wealth, who ruled over 42 lesser kings.
The legends claimed his armies were accompanied by mythical beasts like centaurs.
And that his capital city was a literal utopia. His palace was said to be constructed of solid crystal, featuring a massive emerald dining table and pillars carved from single blocks of amethyst.
It sounds like a fantasy novel.
But the Europeans believed it was a geographical fact. And more importantly, they believed that Prester John was a staunch ally, just waiting for Europe to make contact so they could launch a massive two-front crusade to crush the Islamic world. European explorers spent decades desperately trying to find this crystal palace.
But the reality of the Ethiopian Christian Empire in the 15th and 16th centuries was starkly different from the European fantasy. Ethiopia was indeed a deeply ancient, fiercely devout Christian empire. But it was not a utopia. It was entirely landlocked and isolated, surrounded by hostile, expanding Muslim sultanates.
And internally, the empire was constantly fracturing, dealing with localized rebellions from rival warlords.
Exactly. Because of this constant internal and external pressure, the Ethiopian emperor, who held the title of Negus Nagast, or King of Kings, did not live in a crystal palace with an emerald table. He lived in a state of perpetual mobilization.
The capital of Ethiopia was a massive, moving city of tents.
The logistics of this mobile capital are astounding. The royal court, the bureaucracy, the treasury, and the standing army amounting to tens of thousands of people had to constantly pack up and move across the rugged Ethiopian highlands to project power, put down rebellions, and consume the resources of different provinces as a form of taxation.
And the emperor himself was treated not just as a king, but as a terrifying, secluded demigod. He was completely isolated from his own people. The sources detail how he was kept hidden behind heavy brocade curtains within a vast labyrinthine scarlet tent.
And when he was forced to ride out in public, his face was heavily veiled, and his procession was preceded by guards leading chained, roaring lions.
Chained lions. It was a raw, martial, highly volatile form of psychological dominance.
And into this volatile, deeply insular, moving tent city enters Helena. She was not born into the Ethiopian Christian royalty. She was originally a Muslim princess from the neighboring kingdom of Dawaro.
So how did she get there?
The Ethiopian emperor, Beta Mariam, arranged a marriage with her as a calculated diplomatic move to secure a tenuous peace on his border. Upon her marriage, Helena converted to Christianity. And she didn't just convert in name only to survive the court politics. She became a profound theological scholar.
She learned the complex theology of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and actually authored 2 highly regarded religious texts, including one with the incredible title, Praise Ye with Organs.
Her background gave her a unique, unparalleled perspective. She possessed an intimate understanding of the Islamic sultanates she came from, and a deep mastery of a Christian empire she had married into. When her husband died, and through a series of successions, she eventually became the regent for her young grandson, the Emperor Lebna Dengel, she used that dual perspective to analyze the geopolitical map.
While the Ethiopian generals and warlords were focused on localized seasonal skirmishes with neighboring tribes, Helena zoomed out. She looked at the macro picture and saw a massive existential storm brewing on the horizon.
Helena recognized the shifting tectonic plates of global power. She saw the meteoric rise of the Ottoman Empire in Turkey. She understood that the Ottomans were actively reviving the concept of the jihad, the holy war, to expand their influence. More critically, she saw that the Ottomans were beginning to arm the small Muslim states bordering Ethiopia with modern military technology. Specifically, matchlock muskets and artillery cannons.
Gunpowder.
She looked at her own army, which relied on brilliant but traditional mountain warfare, using spears, swords, and cavalry, and realized the horrifying truth. The traditional Abyssinian military tactics were going to be entirely annihilated by Ottoman-backed gunpowder.
It was an existential threat. Ethiopia was completely isolated. They couldn't manufacture their own firearms. Helena knew they needed an ally. A powerful Christian maritime ally who could supply modern weapons and attack the Muslim states from the coast.
And right on cue, the European obsession with the myth of Prester John drops the perfect opportunity directly into her lap.
Tell us about Pedro de Covilham.
In the late 15th century, an exhausted Portuguese explorer named Pedro de Covilham actually managed to navigate through the hostile territories and reached the moving tent city of the Ethiopian court. He had been dispatched by the King of Portugal specifically to find Prester John.
Now, previous Ethiopian emperors had viewed these rare European travelers with deep suspicion, essentially holding Kovalham under luxurious house arrest, refusing to let him leave the country. They saw European outsiders as potential spies or destabilizing influences.
But Helena, possessing a strategic mind, saw Kovalham not as a captive curiosity, but as a geopolitical lifeline.
So to put this in perspective for you listening, Europe spends centuries looking for a mythical wizard king with an amethyst palace, and what they actually stumble into is a brilliant, pragmatic female regent operating out of a tent who is playing complex geopolitical chess with global spice routes and religious proxy wars. It's like searching the North Pole for Santa Claus and discovering a master military strategist running a global logistics network.
It is a perfect collision of myth and reality. Helena engaged with Kovalham and rapidly decoded the true motivations of the Portuguese Empire. She realized that the Portuguese weren't just sailing around looking for Christian fellowship, they were driven by brutal mercantilism.
They wanted to break the Arab monopoly on the incredibly lucrative Indian Ocean spice trade. They wanted money. They wanted maritime control of the Red Sea ports.
Exactly. She realized that Portugal's imperial desire to destroy the Muslim fleets in the Red Sea to secure the spice trade aligned perfectly with Ethiopia's desperate need to destroy the Muslim armies amassing on their land borders. It was a perfect, pragmatic convergence of interests.
So, defying the isolationist paranoia of the traditional Ethiopian court, Helena orchestrated a massive diplomatic mission. She appointed an Armenian merchant named Matthew as her personal ambassador and sent him on a harrowing years-long journey all the way to Lisbon to propose a formal military alliance with the King of Portugal.
She drafts an alliance based on mutual benefit. She essentially tells Portugal, "You want to control the wealth of the spice trade. Send us muskets and soldiers to help us survive the Ottoman proxy war, and we will help you secure the coastal ports."
It was a grueling diplomatic process that took years, but her structural strategy worked.
The Portuguese, recognizing the strategic value of a Christian stronghold in the Horn of Africa, eventually dispatched a naval fleet and a highly trained military force armed with muskets. They arrived just as the massive Ottoman-backed invasion, led by the Muslim leader Ahmed Gran, began to sweep across the Ethiopian highlands.
It was a brutal, devastating war, and Helena tragically did not live to see the final conclusion. But the Portuguese musketeers she secured tipped the balance of power. The Ethiopian-Portuguese coalition eventually defeated Gran's army, killing him in battle.
Helena's geopolitical pivot, her ability to look beyond the immediate mountains and understand global trade dynamics, absolutely saved the Ethiopian Empire from being entirely wiped off the map.
Her legacy is a masterclass in structural leadership. True leadership, especially in moments of existential crisis, is rarely about swinging a sword on the front lines. It is about intellectual foresight. It is about seeing the demographic and technological shifts before they cross your borders, understanding the raw economic motivations of foreign powers, and possessing the political courage to defy your own isolationist advisors, to find unconventional allies.
She saved a civilization because she understood the world outside her tent.
Okay, let's take a breath and synthesize everything we've unpacked today, because we have covered thousands of years, analyzed vastly different cultures, and traversed an entire continent. We have seen women who fundamentally engineered economies and infrastructure, like Hatshepsut mobilizing the resources of Egypt to bring back the myrrh trees of Punt, and Amina cultivating a wealthy middle class in Meroe.
And we have analyzed women who defended their agrarian or commercial way of life with uncompromising force, like the Kahina weaponizing the very landscape of North Africa in a tragic scorched-earth defense, and Queen Amina building massive rammed-earth garrisons to monopolize the wealth of the Sahara.
And we've seen women who outthought the expanding empires of the globe, like Empress Helena manipulating the Portuguese desire for spice monopolies to save her civilization from gunpowder.
And if there is one overarching, undeniable takeaway from the historical mechanisms we've explored today, it is that these women were not ruling because of some lingering, mythical, matriarchal utopia. They were not remnants of a peaceful goddess cult.
No, they ruled because they were incredibly, undeniably capable of navigating a ruthless, unforgiving patriarchal world. They understood logistics, they mastered the art of propaganda, they grasped complex macroeconomics, and they were brilliant at military strategy.
They exploited the vulnerabilities of male-dominated systems to seize power, and they wielded that power just as effectively and often more creatively than the men who preceded them.
It forces us to confront how much richer, how much more accurate our understanding of global politics and statecraft would be if these complex narratives were central to our historical education, rather than relegated to footnotes or mythological anomalies.
It really does. It changes how you view history entirely.
But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final, haunting detail from the archaeological records we examined today. We talked extensively about Meroe, the wealthy, iron-forging kingdom of the Candaces that held off the Roman Empire. When Meroe was finally inevitably destroyed by King Ezana of Aksum around 350 AD, the civilization collapsed and the people scattered. But a specific group, known as the Khajiit, fled west, deep into the harsh expanse of the Sudanese desert.
And according to the oral folklore of their descendants, which has been fiercely preserved and passed down for centuries, they survived that brutal exodus because they were led to safety through the desert by a queen.
And out in the remote Sudanese desert, right now, as we speak, there is a massive unexcavated grave mound. The local people emphatically state that it is her tomb.
It is just sitting there, untouched beneath the sand.
Waiting. It forces you to ask a profound question. Based on everything we've learned today, how many more Hatshepsuts, how many more brilliant Candaces, how many more tactical geniuses like Amina are buried under the earth, simply waiting for us to dig up the evidence and finally tell their stories? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the edited history you've been taught, look for the missing pages, and we will catch you next time.